If you're going to pretend, at least pretend correctly, the man said, his voice smooth and loud enough to travel across the polished marble floor, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade made of silk, and just like that, the restaurant fell into a quiet that wasn't silence, but attention, the kind that gathers when something uncomfortable is about to unfold, when people sense a moment they shouldn't watch but won't look away from anyway. And near the center of that moment stood Amora Johnson, 8 years old, barely tall enough to see over the edge of the white tablecloths, her small hand steady against the leather-bound menu she had been carrying, her uniform slightly oversized, sleeves rolled once, then twice, as if the world had handed her something too big and she had simply decided to make it fit, and across from her sat Richard Whitmore, a man known in the city for turning silence into profit and rooms into territory, his silver watch catching the warm glow of the chandelier above, his posture relaxed in the way only someone completely certain of their power could afford to be. He didn't look at her like a child, he looked at her like a test, and without waiting for her to respond, he leaned back slightly in his chair and began to speak again, this time in Italian, the words flowing quickly, deliberately complex, laced with an accent that sounded practiced but not quite lived in. The kind of performance meant less for communication and more for display. A few diners nearby exchanged glances. One woman lifted her glass but didn't drink, a man in a navy suit paused mid-bite, and somewhere near the bar, a server stopped walking altogether, because everyone understood what was happening even if no one said it out loud. This wasn't about ordering food, this was about proving a point, and the point was standing right there in front of him in worn shoes and quiet eyes. Amora listened without interrupting, her gaze not fixed on his face, but somewhere just below it, as if she were measuring something invisible, the rhythm of his voice, the slight hesitation between phrases, the way his vowels stretched just a fraction too long, and when he finished, he gave a small, satisfied smile, the kind that expects confusion, maybe embarrassment, maybe a quick apology followed by a nervous laugh, something to confirm the imbalance he had just created. Well, he added, tapping his fingers lightly against the table, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, and for a second, nothing happened. No one moved, no one spoke, even the music seemed to lower itself, as if the room itself was waiting, and Amora took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough, her fingers adjusting slightly on the menu, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and entirely unexpected. She answered him in Italian, not rushed, not hesitant, but steady, precise, and unmistakably fluent, the kind of fluency that didn't come from memorizing phrases but from understanding them, and more than that, she didn't just repeat his order, she corrected it, gently, almost kindly, pointing out a small grammatical slip, a misplaced article, the kind of mistake only someone truly familiar with the language would notice, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but sharp, like the moment a glass develops a crack before it shatters. Richard's smile didn't disappear all at once, it faltered, just slightly, like a light flickering in a room that had always been perfectly lit. His fingers stopped tapping, his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, and around them, the silence deepened, no longer curious, now something closer to stunned, because in a single sentence, the balance had changed, the test had turned, and the person who had set it was no longer the one in control. Amora didn't raise her voice, didn't look around to see who was watching, she simply finished speaking, her tone respectful but firm, as if she were doing exactly what she had been asked to do, nothing more, nothing less, and then she waited, not nervously, not impatiently, just present, while across from her, Richard Whitmore, a man who had built his life on knowing exactly what would happen next, found himself in a moment he had never prepared for, a moment where the script he thought he was writing had quietly, completely, been taken out of his hands. Richard did not answer right away, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, not the words, not the correction, but the silence, because a man like him was never silent without purpose, yet this time there was no control in it, only a pause that stretched just a second too long, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her, not with anger, not yet, but with something sharper, something closer to disbelief, as if the world had just broken one of his private rules and he was deciding whether to fix it or deny it ever happened. A faint chuckle came from somewhere behind him, quickly swallowed, and the air shifted again, not in her favor yet, but no longer entirely in his. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table, his fingers interlacing as if he were settling into a negotiation instead of a dinner. "That is impressive," he said slowly, his tone smooth again but thinner now, stretched over something unsettled, Memorization can be a powerful trick, he added, just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, just soft enough to sound almost like a compliment, and a few heads nodded, grateful for a version of reality that restored the balance they understood, because it was easier to believe she had rehearsed something than to accept that she had simply known it. Amora did not react, she did not rush to defend herself or correct him again, she only stood there, still holding the menu. Her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, as if she had already decided she did not need to win anything in that moment, only to remain exactly where she was, and that quiet confidence unsettled him more than any argument could have. Let us try something simpler, Richard continued, switching again, this time faster, more intricate, his Italian slipping into a dialect, the cadence shifting, the phrasing becoming more specific, less polished, more lived in, or at least intended to sound that way. It was no longer a performance for the room, it was a challenge directed entirely at her, a narrowing of focus, like a spotlight tightening, the kind of move he had used in boardrooms when he wanted to corner someone into revealing their limits. A server near the bar took a step closer without realizing it, a couple at the window stopped talking altogether, even the soft clink of silverware seemed to fade, and Amora listened again, her head tilting just slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, and when he finished, he leaned back once more, this time with a hint of expectation sharpened into something more deliberate. Go on, he said, a small smile returning, though it no longer reached his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the room held its breath again, but this time it felt different, less certain, less predictable, because whatever had just happened once could happen again, and Amora shifted her weight just enough to set the menu down gently on the edge of the table, her fingers releasing it as if she no longer needed the prop at all, and when she spoke, she did not mirror his pace, she slowed it, her voice softer, but clearer, her Italian not just correct but grounded, the vowels shaped with an ease that did not perform itself, and then she did something no one expected. She asked him a question, simple in structure, but precise in detail, referencing a local expression from a small region, something that did not appear in textbooks or travel guides, something that lived in kitchens and quiet streets, passed between people who belonged there, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Richard's expression changed again, this time without any attempt to hide it, his brow tightening, his lips parting slightly as if to respond, then closing again when nothing came, because he understood the question, he understood exactly what it meant, and more importantly, he understood what it revealed, that she was not repeating language, she was speaking from within it, and around them, the silence shifted once more, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but heavy with a realization that moved from table to table without a single word being spoken. The balance had not just tilted, it had turned. And for the first time since he had spoken that first line, Richard Whitmore did not look like a man in control of the room, he looked like someone trying to remember how he had lost it, while across from him Amora Johnson stood exactly where she had been all along, unchanged, unshaken, and quietly, unmistakably, ahead. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, not because it was complicated, but because it demanded something far more dangerous than knowledge. It demanded authenticity, and Richard felt it immediately, a subtle tightening in his chest, a flicker of recognition he could not quite place, the kind that does not come from language itself but from memory, from somewhere deeper, older, quieter. His fingers shifted against each other, no longer interlocked, now restless, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, he glanced away from her, not toward the crowd, not toward the menu, but toward the window, where the reflection of the room stared back at him with a clarity he did not expect, the chandeliers glowing above, the polished glasses, the neatly dressed guests, all of it intact, all of it unchanged, except for the man sitting at the center of it, because something in that single question had reached past the surface and tapped against a part of him he had not visited in years, and when he finally looked back at Amora, the distance between them felt different, not measured in feet, but in something far more difficult to control. That is not standard usage, he said at last, his voice measured, controlled, but missing the ease it carried before, as if each word now required a little more effort than it should. A few people shifted in their seats, sensing the change but not fully understanding it, because what they were witnessing was not a loss of authority in the obvious sense, but something quieter, more unsettling, a crack forming in a place that had always seemed solid. Amora did not challenge him, she did not argue or correct him again, she simply tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost curious, as if she were watching him make a choice rather than waiting for an answer, and that was when it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Richard hesitated, a brief pause that stretched just enough to be seen, and in that pause, the room understood something had shifted again, because men like him did not hesitate, not in public, not like this, and yet there it was, a moment where certainty slipped just enough to reveal what lay beneath it. He cleared his throat softly, adjusting his cuff as if the movement could reset the rhythm of the moment. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, the question coming out more direct than he intended, stripped of its earlier performance, and for the first time, it was not a challenge, it was genuine. Amora's eyes flickered, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had been waiting for that question all along, her hands resting lightly at her sides now, no longer holding anything, no longer needing to. "From my mother," she said simply, her voice steady, not loud, not soft, just clear, and something in the way she said it carried weight, not heavy, not dramatic, but real, the kind of truth that does not need decoration to be understood. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze narrowing again, but not in the same way as before. This time it was searching, not for a mistake, but for a connection. "Your mother," he repeated, slower now, as if testing the words, and Amora nodded once. "She used to teach languages," she continued, still calm, still composed, but now there was something else beneath her tone, not sadness, not anger, but something quieter, something that lingered just under the surface. "Italian, French, sometimes Spanish," she said. "Language is not just words. It is where people keep their lives." A faint murmur passed through the room, barely audible, but present, because the statement carried something more than information. It carried meaning, and Richard felt it settle somewhere he had not expected, a place behind the practiced layers of his expression, behind the confidence he had built so carefully over the years, because there was a memory there, distant but not gone, a voice, a classroom, the sound of a language spoken slowly, patiently, corrected with care instead of judgment, and without realizing it, his eyes dropped, just for a moment, to his own wrist, to the silver watch that caught the light with the same quiet precision it always had, except now it did not feel like an accessory, it felt like a reminder, and when he looked back at her again, the room around them seemed to fade slightly, not disappearing, but losing its importance, because whatever was happening now was no longer about the audience, no longer about the performance, it was about something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before either of them stepped into that restaurant, and was only now beginning to reveal itself. The word mother did not leave the room when she said it, it lingered, settling into the quiet spaces between breaths and glances, and Richard felt it again, sharper this time, not just a memory but a thread pulling gently at something he had spent years keeping tightly wound, his eyes returning once more to the watch on his wrist, the polished silver catching the chandelier light in small, controlled reflections, but now those reflections felt different, less like a symbol of success and more like a question he had not yet answered. He shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creasing under his movement, a subtle sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, and when he looked back at Amora, his expression had changed again, not softer, not yet, but no longer guarded in the same way, as if he had stepped out of the role he had been playing and was now standing somewhere less certain. "What is her name?" he asked, the words quieter than anything he had said before, and that alone caused a ripple through the room, because the tone was different, unmistakably so, no longer testing, no longer performing, but searching, and Amora did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she chose the moment carefully, her eyes steady on his, reading him in a way that felt far older than her years. "Elena," she said finally, and the name landed with a weight that did not need explanation. Something in the way it was spoken carried history. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply rooted, and Richard's breath caught just slightly, barely visible, but enough, because that name was not unfamiliar to him, not in the way names usually are. It did not arrive as new information, it arrived as recognition, quiet and undeniable, and for a second, the restaurant faded even further, the low music, the soft clink of glasses, the muted conversations all slipping into the background as something older, something quieter, began to surface, a classroom with tall windows, sunlight falling across wooden desks, a voice correcting his pronunciation with patience instead of judgment, a woman who did not rush him, who did not make him feel small when he struggled, who treated language not as a tool to impress but as a bridge to understand, and without realizing it, his hand moved slightly, his thumb brushing against the edge of his watch, a small, unconscious gesture, as if grounding himself in the present while something from the past pressed gently forward. "Elena," he repeated, slower now, tasting the name as if it carried more than just sound, and Amora watched him closely, not with expectation, not with hope, but with a quiet certainty, as if she already knew what he was beginning to realize. She taught me that people show you who they are when they think you do not understand them, Amora continued, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying a subtle edge, not sharp, not confrontational, just honest, and the words settled into the space between them with precision, because they were not just a statement, they were a reflection, and Richard felt it immediately, the weight of his earlier words, the tone, the intention, all of it returning to him now not as something distant, but as something he had just done, something he could not reframe or soften, and for the first time, the room did not feel like a stage, it felt like a mirror, and he was standing in front of it without the usual distance he relied on. A faint shift moved through the nearby tables, not loud, not obvious, but present, people leaning slightly forward, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to understanding, because the moment had changed again, no longer about language, no longer about cleverness, but about something deeper, something that could not be performed or controlled, and Richard exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt heavier than it should have, as if he were letting go of something he had not realized he was holding, his gaze dropping briefly to the table, then returning to her, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, not polished, not sharpened, but real. And what do you think I showed you? He asked, and it was not a challenge, not a test, but a question he was not entirely sure he wanted answered, and Amora did not hesitate this time, her response coming with the same calm clarity she had carried from the beginning, someone who wanted to be understood, she said, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering, but forgot how to understand first, and the words did not strike like an attack, they settled, quiet and undeniable, and in that moment, surrounded by polished glass and soft light, Richard Whitmore felt something shift inside him that no audience, no deal, no victory had ever forced him to face before, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably real. For a moment, no one moved, not because they were waiting for something dramatic, but because the moment itself had already become something rare, something that did not need to be amplified to be felt, and Richard sat there, the weight of her words settling into him in a way that felt unfamiliar, not like criticism, not like defeat, but like recognition, the kind that does not come from being told who you are, but from suddenly seeing it for yourself. His hand remained near his watch, his thumb brushing against its edge again, slower this time, almost thoughtful, as if the object had shifted from a symbol of status into something else entirely, something connected to a memory he could no longer ignore, and the room around them stayed quiet, not tense, not expectant, but attentive, as though everyone understood that whatever came next would not be loud, but it would matter. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show that something inside him had changed. Not completely, not yet, but enough to alter the way he held himself in that chair, and when he finally spoke, his voice did not carry across the room the way it had before, it stayed closer, more contained, as if it belonged only to the space between him and the girl standing in front of him. She used to say something like that, he said, almost to himself, the words coming carefully, as if they had not been used in a long time, and Amora did not interrupt, she did not fill the silence, she allowed it to remain, because some truths needed space to arrive on their own. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting again, not away from her, but through something, as if the present moment had opened a door to somewhere he had not planned to visit. She told me language is not about sounding right, he continued, his tone quieter now, it is about listening long enough to hear what people mean when they are not saying everything. And there was a faint shift in the room, subtle but undeniable, because the man speaking now did not sound like the one who had entered earlier. The sharp edge had softened, not into weakness, but into something more human, something less rehearsed. Amora's expression did not change much, but her eyes held a different kind of attention now, not just observing, but acknowledging, as if she recognized the shift for what it was, not a performance, but a step. And Richard looked at her again, really looked this time, not at her uniform, not at her height, not at the role she was standing in, but at her, the steadiness in her posture, the calm in her gaze, the quiet confidence that had never once asked for permission to exist, and something about that unsettled him in the best possible way, because it did not fit into any category he had prepared for. How long have you been working here? He asked, the question simple, but sincere, and Amora answered without hesitation. After school, most days, she said, her voice steady. I help my mom when she needs it. And again, the word mom carried something with it, not heavy, not dramatic, but grounded, real, and Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, not as information, but as context, as something that reshaped the moment into something larger than what it had appeared to be at first. And she still teaches? He asked, and there was a quiet curiosity in his tone now. Not probing, not testing, just wanting to understand. Amora's gaze shifted slightly, just for a second, before returning to him. Not anymore, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no resentment, just a fact, spoken plainly, but the simplicity of it carried more weight than explanation would have, and Richard felt that too, the absence of something, the quiet space where a life had changed direction. And for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing easy to say, nothing that would fit neatly into the kind of conversations he was used to having. And around them, the restaurant remained still, not frozen, but respectful, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that did not belong to them, something that was unfolding between two people from entirely different worlds, and yet somehow meeting in the same place, at the same time, for a reason that was only just beginning to make itself known. And Richard's hand finally moved away from his watch, resting instead on the table, open, no longer tapping, no longer performing, just still. And when he looked at Amora again, there was no trace of the earlier challenge left in his eyes, only a quiet, steady awareness, the kind that comes when someone realizes that the moment they thought they controlled had, in fact, been guiding them somewhere else all along. The quiet did not break, it deepened, settling over the room like a soft weight that no one wanted to disturb, and Richard remained where he was, his hand resting open against the table, his posture no longer arranged for effect but shaped by something more honest, something less practiced, and for the first time since the evening began, he did not seem like a man who had entered a room to control it, but someone who had unexpectedly found himself learning inside it. His gaze moved once more. Not across the crowd, not toward the polished glass or the dim golden lights, but back to Amora, and there was something different in the way he looked at her now, not measuring, not testing, but listening, truly listening, as if the space between them had shifted from a stage into a conversation that mattered. What happened? He asked quietly, the question simple, but carrying a weight that reached beyond curiosity, and Amora did not rush to answer. She glanced briefly toward the far end of the room where the kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, the sound soft, almost distant. Before returning her attention to him, she stopped teaching when the school closed her program, she said, her voice even, steady, not heavy with emotion, but not empty either. It carried truth in its simplest form, and Richard nodded slowly, the information settling into place. Not as a statistic, not as a passing detail, but as a piece of something larger he was beginning to understand. Budget cuts, he asked, almost automatically, the language of his world slipping in before he could stop it, and Amora shook her head slightly. No, they said it was not necessary anymore, she replied, her eyes steady. They said people only needed enough to get by, and there was no accusation in her tone, no bitterness, just a quiet repetition of something she had heard before, something that had been decided somewhere far from where she stood. And Richard felt that answer land differently, because it was not unfamiliar. It echoed something he had heard in rooms filled with numbers and projections, in meetings where decisions were made with clean logic and distant consequences, and for a brief second, those rooms overlapped with this one, the polished conference tables and the white tablecloth beneath his hand blending in a way that made the connection impossible to ignore. His fingers curled slightly against the surface. Not in tension, but in awareness, and he exhaled slowly, enough to get by. He repeated, quieter now, as if the phrase carried a meaning he had not questioned before, and Amora watched him, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with that same steady presence she had held from the beginning, the kind that did not push, but did not step back either. And something about that steadiness made it impossible for him to retreat into the distance he usually kept. She did not agree with that. Amora continued, her voice still calm, but now there was a subtle strength beneath it, something that reflected more than just memory. She said language is how people find each other, and if you take that away, you make the world smaller than it needs to be. And the words moved through the room quietly, not announced, not emphasized, but felt, because they carried something that could not be reduced to a simple idea. They carried a belief, and Richard felt it settle somewhere deeper this time, not just in his thoughts, but in the way he saw the moment unfolding in front of him. His gaze drifted again, briefly, to the watch on his wrist. And this time he did not just notice it, he remembered. A small office, a desk near a window, a woman placing the watch into his hand with a smile that did not expect anything in return, just a quiet encouragement, a belief that he could become something more than what he saw at the time, and he had taken it, won it, carried it forward into a life that had grown far beyond that room, and yet somehow, he had left parts of that beginning behind, parts that now seemed to be standing right in front of him. In a different form, in a different voice, but carrying the same truth. And when he looked back at Amora, there was no distance left in his expression, only recognition, the kind that does not come from knowing someone, but from understanding something about yourself through them. She sounds like someone I should have listened to longer, he said quietly, and there was no performance in it, no attempt to regain control, just honesty, simple and unguarded. And Amora's expression softened just slightly, not in triumph, not in validation, but in acknowledgement, as if she recognized the shift for what it was, not an ending, but a beginning. And around them, the restaurant remained still, not because the world had stopped, but because for a brief moment, something more important than the usual noise had taken its place, something that did not need to be announced to be understood, and Richard sat there, no longer the man who had entered to test someone else, but someone who had just begun to see what he had been missing all along. The words lingered between them, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something more important had already been understood, and Richard sat there with a stillness that no longer felt forced, his shoulders relaxed, his posture no longer shaped by expectation, but by awareness, the kind that arrives quietly and stays, and his eyes moved once more to the watch on his wrist, not out of habit this time, but with intention, his fingers brushing against the cool metal as if confirming that it was real, that the memory attached to it had not been imagined. And then, slowly, he unfastened it, the small clasp, releasing with a soft click that seemed to echo louder than any conversation in the room. A few nearby guests shifted slightly, not because they understood what it meant, but because they felt that something had changed again, something subtle but undeniable, and Richard held the watch in his hand for a brief moment, turning it just enough for the light to catch its surface, before placing it gently on the table between them, not as a display, not as a gesture meant to impress, but as something returned to its original purpose, something no longer worn as a symbol, but offered as a connection. She gave this to me, he said quietly, his voice steady but unguarded, a long time ago, when I did not have much of anything, and the words carried no embellishment, no attempt to shape them into something more than they were, just a truth, simple and direct. And Amora's gaze dropped briefly to the watch, then lifted back to him. Her expression unchanged in its calm, but deeper now, more attentive, as if she understood that what he was offering was not the object itself, but the meaning behind it. She told me it was not about keeping time, he continued, his eyes no longer avoiding the past. It was about remembering where you started, so you do not forget who helped you get there. And for a second, the room seemed to hold that thought, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken. And Amora took a small step closer to the table, not reaching for the watch, not claiming it, just acknowledging its presence. She still says things like that, she replied, her voice soft but steady, and there was something in her tone that made it clear that those lessons had not been left behind, they had been carried forward, lived in. And Richard nodded slowly, as if that confirmation settled something inside him that had been unsettled for longer than he realized. His hand remained on the table, open, no longer tapping, no longer controlling, just present. I built a life where I thought understanding meant being the smartest person in the room, he said. The admission coming without hesitation now, as if the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming had shortened in a way he could no longer ignore. But somewhere along the way, I stopped listening to the people who taught me what that actually meant, and there was no audience in his voice, no performance left, only reflection. And Amora watched him quietly, not with approval, not with judgment, but with the same steady presence she had held from the beginning, the kind that did not rush change, but allowed it to happen. And for the first time, Richard did not look like a man trying to fix a mistake quickly. He looked like someone willing to understand it fully, even if it took longer than he was used to. And around them, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again, the soft clink of glasses returning, the low murmur of conversation rising carefully, as if people were stepping back into their own lives after witnessing something they would not easily forget. And Richard glanced briefly around the room. Not to reclaim it, not to reassert himself, but simply to notice it, to see it without the lens he had always used. And when his gaze returned to Amora, there was a quiet clarity in it, something settled, something decided. I would like to meet her, he said, the word simple, but carrying a weight that extended beyond curiosity, beyond politeness, into something more intentional, something that acknowledged not just the moment they were in, but the path that had led them there. Anamora did not respond right away. She held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring not his words, but the sincerity behind them, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as permission, not as approval, but as recognition, because something in that moment had already changed, something that did not need to be confirmed out loud to be real. The nod was small, almost invisible, but it carried more weight than any agreement spoken out loud, and Richard felt it immediately, not as permission granted, but as something earned, something fragile that required care, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the watch still resting between them on the white tablecloth, catching the warm light in quiet reflections that seemed softer now, less sharp, as if even the object understood it no longer needed to prove anything, and Richard's gaze lingered on it briefly before lifting again to meet Amora's eyes, and there was something steady there now, not the certainty he had worn earlier, but something more grounded, something built on understanding rather than control. "I did not expect tonight to go this way," he said, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, and there was no attempt to disguise the truth in it, no effort to reshape it into something more comfortable. And Amora gave the slightest hint of a smile, not wide, not triumphant. Just enough to show she understood that sometimes the most important moments are the ones no one plans for, and the quiet around them began to loosen, the restaurant slowly returning to its rhythm, the soft murmur of conversations rising again, the faint clink of silverware reappearing like distant echoes of normalcy, but the space around their table remained different, set apart in a way that could not be undone by noise. And Richard shifted slightly in his chair, not to regain control, but to settle into the moment as it was. "Does she still believe that?" he asked after a pause, his tone gentle now, almost careful, as if he did not want to disturb something that had taken time to reveal itself, and Amora tilted her head slightly, considering the question, not because she did not know the answer, but because she chose how to give it. "She never stopped," she said simply, and there was something unwavering in her voice, something that carried quiet pride without needing to announce it, and Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, not as a distant idea, but as something immediate. "Something real. I think I forgot what that sounds like," he admitted, and there was no hesitation in the words, no attempt to soften them, just an honest acknowledgement that seemed to settle into the space between them like a truth long overdue. And Amora watched him for a moment, her eyes steady, not searching, not questioning, just present, and then she spoke again, her voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. "People do not forget," she said. "They just get used to not hearing it." And the sentence landed gently, not as a correction, not as a lesson, but as something offered, something that did not demand agreement but invited reflection, and Richard felt that too, the subtle shift in perspective, the way the words did not push against him but instead opened something, a space he had not realized had been closed, and his gaze moved once more, not out of habit, but out of intention, taking in the room around him, the people, the light, the quiet details he had overlooked before. And when his attention returned to Amora, there was a different kind of clarity in his expression, not the sharpness of analysis, but the steadiness of understanding. "I spent a long time thinking success meant never being corrected," he said, his voice low, reflective, "but I think it might mean the opposite," and there was a faint shift in the way the word settled, not as a conclusion, but as a realization still forming. And Amora did not respond right away, she simply held his gaze, allowing the thought to exist without rushing it forward, and for a moment, that was enough, the silence between them no longer uncertain, no longer heavy, but balanced, and then, gently, she reached toward the table, not for the watch itself, but for the edge of the cloth near it, adjusting it slightly where it had folded, a small, almost instinctive motion, but one that carried a quiet care, a reminder that presence could be expressed in the smallest of ways, and Richard noticed it, not the action alone, but the intention behind it, the quiet attention to detail, the respect for the space they shared, and something in that moment settled fully within him, not dramatically, not suddenly, but completely, as if a question he had not known he was asking had finally been answered, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that clarity, simple and unforced. "Thank you," he said, not for the service, not for the exchange alone, but for something deeper, something that had shifted inside him in a way he could not ignore. And Amora nodded once more, just as quietly as before, not accepting the gratitude as something owed, but acknowledging it as something real, and around them, the restaurant moved forward, but the moment remained, held not in silence, not in spectacle, but in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important changes do not arrive loudly, they arrive like this, steady, undeniable, and impossible to forget. The moment did not end with applause or spectacle, it settled into something quieter, something that stayed long after the noise of the room returned, and Richard remained seated for a second longer than necessary, his hand resting near the watch, not reaching for it yet, as if he understood that picking it up too quickly would undo something he had only just begun to understand. The light above continued to reflect softly across its surface. No longer sharp, no longer demanding attention, just present, and across from him, Amora stood with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning, unchanged by the shift in power, unchanged by the attention, as if none of this had altered who she was, only revealed it more clearly, and Richard looked at her one last time, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and then he did something small, something that did not draw attention, but carried meaning all the same. He slid the watch slightly closer to her side of the table, not as a gift, not as something to be taken, but as a quiet offering, a bridge between where he had been and where he was choosing to go, and Amora glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just understanding. "It belongs to your story," she said gently, her voice calm, "not mine," and the words were simple, but they carried clarity, the kind that did not reject what was offered, but placed it exactly where it needed to be, and Richard paused, his fingers still, absorbing that, because he understood what she meant, that growth was not about handing something away, it was about carrying it differently, remembering it properly, and he nodded once, slowly, his hand finally closing around the watch again, not with the same unconscious habit as before, but with intention, as if he were holding not just an object, but the weight of everything it represented, and as he fastened it back onto his wrist, the small click of the clasp felt different this time, not like a routine, but like a decision, and he stood then, not abruptly, not with the presence he had entered with, but with a quiet steadiness that matched the moment, his chair sliding back softly against the floor, and for a brief second, the people nearby glanced over, not out of curiosity now, but with a subtle respect, as if they had witnessed something they could not quite explain but would not forget, and Richard reached into his jacket, placing payment on the table without ceremony, without excess, just enough, nothing more, nothing performative, and then he looked back at Amora, meeting her eyes one final time. "Tell her I remember now," he said, his voice steady, and there was no need to explain further, because the meaning was already there, fully formed, and Amora gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement she had offered before, not accepting responsibility for his change, but recognizing it as real, and Richard turned then, stepping away from the table, not as someone leaving a place behind, but as someone carrying something forward, his steps measured, unhurried, blending into the rhythm of the room that had resumed around him, but something about him had shifted in a way that did not fade with distance, and as he moved toward the exit, the reflections in the glass doors caught him for just a second. A familiar figure, but not the same man who had walked in, and behind him, Amora remained where she was, adjusting the table slightly, smoothing the cloth, restoring the space not to erase what had happened, but to continue what came next, her movements calm, precise, grounded in the same quiet dignity she had shown from the start, and the restaurant carried on, the conversations rising, the light steady, the ordinary returning, but beneath it all, something had changed, something that would not be undone by time or noise, because the most important shifts rarely announce themselves. They happen like this, in a single conversation, in a single moment, where one person chooses to listen, and another never needed to ask to be heard.